Well, welcome, Prince. Thank you for joining our YouTube channel today. I have a special guest on for us today. His name is Dr. Mark Wilson, and he is an expert in how archaeology and the Bible sort of interact and how archaeology illuminates for us certain portions of Scripture. He's the director of Asia Minor Research Center based in Turkey. He's living in Turkey now. He's authored a number of books. He's a pretty regular contributor to Biblical Archaeology Review, and he is a specialist in the New Testament. And so I want to welcome Dr. Mark Wilson. Dr. Wilson, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, absolutely. I'm an American. Sometimes people think I'm South African because my terminal degree is there, but grew up in North Dakota and then moved to the East Coast to Virginia to do my master's work. And that's been our base now for the last 40 years around Norfolk, Virginia Beach. But I first came to Turkey in 1992. I'd never been out of the United States, and I was just starting my own doctoral work in the Book of Revelation, working on the seven churches. And for me, it was just a life-changing experience to actually travel around and see these archaeological sites, and especially Ephesus was just a high point for me to be able to walk through this site, and it was just transformational. And so from that period, I began to travel over here myself, began taking groups. And then in 1997, I had a chance to go to Israel and study historical geography over there. And that was, again, another step of bringing me to where I'm at today. And I just saw how valuable it was to get out in the land, to travel around and to see the impact of historical geography I had on studying both the Old and New Testament. But I saw how saturated Israel was with study programs and institutes. And I thought to myself, there's nothing like this in Turkey. So maybe I should start thinking about doing that. And so after finishing my doctoral studies at South Africa, I taught for 4 years in undergraduate New Testament at Oral Roberts University. And then we made a decision, my wife and I, to come to Turkey, check it out. And then 2004, we moved over here, living first in Izmir, ancient Smyrna, and now we've been 13 years here in Antalya. And so we're just marking a milestone of 2 decades of living here in Turkey. And so it was a very good decision for us, and especially for my own research and writing.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, you've been very interested in how archaeology and the Bible, particularly the Book of Acts, Book of Revelation, interact. Would you be able to walk my viewers through maybe a few specific examples of how some of these sites, some of the geography, some of the archaeological sites that you've looked at, how they illuminate the Bible?
Sure. Let me first start with talking about William Ramsey a bit. So Ramsey, with his classic book on the seven churches and then other volumes on the early church here, were really kind of my intro into this part of the world. And even though they're over a century old, a bit dated, of course, in some areas still, there's a lot of important information. And you have to work through Ramsey to really come to grips with the early church here in Asia Minor. And so Ramsey's background, of course, was in higher critical scholarship, and especially in the background of German training. And so he came over to Turkey and started traveling around and finding inscriptions and whatnot. And he began to say to himself, I'm finding the backgrounds of the New Testament pretty much reflected here on the ground in everything I'm finding. And so he made so many seminal discoveries of inscriptions and sites that related to the biblical world. And so he was really a pioneer in breaking the ground to seeing that what Luke is describing, what John is describing in the text of the New Testament are historically, epigraphically verifiable. And so that sort of approach had an impact on me, in my initial studies. And so as I've traveled around here and done more in-depth research here on sites, I've come to those same conclusions.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. Is there maybe a few of those that you could walk me through? Some of the maybe some specific examples that have really kind of impacted you and really maybe illuminated some of those passages of
Right.
scripture.
So roads and travel have been very intriguing to us. And I've worked with a colleague, Glenn Thompson, in retracing these journeys of Paul. And Luke doesn't really tell us, that they got on this particular road or that, but he gives us cities. And these are all linked by ancient roads. And so we still have sections of these roads still visible in Turkey today. You can actually walk on part of the Via Sebaste north of Antalya, where I live. The Paul and Barnabas walked on part of the Roman road just north of Tarsus that Paul would have traveled on going especially north on his second and third journeys. And along the way, we have these milestones that are dating from the time of Augustus, 2,000 years old, that are still in place. I mean, it's just remarkable. And you're looking at the very things and places that Paul would have seen as he made these extended journeys. And so understanding this road network really helps you understand how the gospel spread out, from Antioch all the way to Ephesus in the middle of the first century. So, this is one area where we spent a lot of time on, and in the course of that, helping to rewrite maps that we see in, Bible geographies, Bible atlases, the maps at the end of Bibles that are often produced, by well-meaning people, but who have never actually been on the ground here. And they're drawing lines over mountains that only birds could fly over. So, so that's one contribution that we're hoping to make, and making more precise the routes that the early church would have traveled on here.
Yeah, that's great. I understand you lead tours through Turkey. Do you have some sites that are favorites among some of the people that you lead through the area?
Well, two of our most popular tours, of course, the seven churches. People come in and we travel those in a week or so. Then Paul's journeys are very popular. And for the long journey, we'll travel all the way from Antioch to Alexandria, Troas, which is about 1,000 miles of travel. And it just brings the reality of the distances that Paul traveled, to modern pilgrims, if we can call them that, who are over here looking at the sites. And in the hot, dusty sites that we're trekking over, we do this in an air-conditioned bus, and 2 weeks it takes us basically to travel between these 2 points. But it really gives you a sense of the sacrifice that Paul made to bring the gospel to all of these places.
So the book of Acts gives us a number of geographical sites, places. I'm thinking of, places where they actually have riots and there's these, Greek gods that are in place. Has your research tended to confirm what's given to us in the book of Acts, or have you found that there's some pretty major discrepancies between what we would expect in the, archaeological findings in terms of how the gospel portrays things? What's your overall take on that?
So one of our major sites here, of course, is Ephesus, and the culmination of Acts chapter 19 is a riot that takes place in the theater there. So, we always basically end our Ephesus tours in the theater, reading the account there of what happens. But just before that, we come from the lower commercial agora. And this is the area where Demetrius and the silversmiths would be selling their wares. Paul, we're told, is working in the same area with Priscilla and Aquila as tent makers. And so you begin to understand how the layout of the city there contributes to the dynamics of the riot as Demetrius mobilizes people to do that. And then we have a town clerk who shows up belatedly to kind of quench the thing, but his office is way up in the upper city. And so when you see, the distance involved and the layout of the geography of the city, what Luke is describing there makes a lot of sense there in the historical record.
Well, I think on a, maybe a lay level, people sort of kind of have this all or nothing approach. I mean, there's conservatives like myself. I take the Bible. I have a high view of scripture. I believe in inerrancy and things like that. But sometimes I'm interacting with people who just think the entire Bible is a complete fairy tale. And I'm not saying this is on a scholarly level, but you do run into people who just think that it's just made up. But I think what you've been able to see as you're traveling through Turkey, these are real geographical sites. These are
Mhm.
real places. The things that are described in the book of Acts are things that actually sort of make sense in relationship to the geography, in relationship to the archaeology. Is that accurate, or am I way off on that?
Well, one of the challenges we still have in Acts scholarship, especially, is a number of scholars who don't think Acts is historical. So I deal with that in my publications, where you got to figure out how to, make a statement related to that. That your approach here in the article is going to be one assuming that Luke is giving us accurate information here in order to make sense of the text. And my critique of so many of these people with that view is they're sort of ivory tower scholars. They just have not gotten out in the field and on the ground. And you come over here and you actually take a bus tour, go to these places and suddenly say that what or see what Luke is describing is real. I mean, and coheres, it makes sense. And so whatever quote unquote discrepancies you see in the text can be explained if you begin to read between the lines and to understand the dynamics of travel and archaeology here in this part of the world. So I think Luke is a very good historian, and our job is to understand what he's doing there, which from a perspective 2,000 years later is a bit challenging for us.
That's interesting. So, William Ramsey was famous. So you're kind of walking in the footsteps of William Ramsey, whom you mentioned before. But he was famous for, having studied those higher critical ideas in Germany, and he said he was quite taken in by the theories. They
Yeah,
thought that
yeah.
Acts was like a second century composition, probably by somebody who's not really super familiar with the area. Just sort of took it very loosely. And then William Ramsey comes, he starts doing the research. My understanding is that he comes to the opposite conclusion of what he had learned in Germany, and says that Luke is a historian of the first rank. And so it sounds like to me that your studies, 100 years later, almost have tended to confirm what William Ramsey initially said about this. Am I right about that?
Yeah, we're continuing to find things that illuminate the text of Acts. So, for example, just east of where I live is a site called Perge, where Paul and Barnabas make landfall, and it's from this area too that John Mark leaves to go back to Jerusalem, after they leave from Paphos there. And in the last 2 decades, there have been inscriptions found in this area, Pamphylia, and then to the west in the region called Lycia, having to do with the provinces that existed, at this period of time. And so, really in both Roman scholarship as well as in New Testament scholarship, we've assumed that Pamphylia and Lycia were together as one province and going from AD 43. But with these new inscriptions, and we have two that have been found in Perge, we now know that Galatia came all the way down to the Mediterranean, including Pamphylia. So this whole discussion we've had about, is it North or South Galatia that Paul is addressing his letters to, or where he traveled, has now been superseded. And we know that Perge and even Attalia here where I live were really the true South Galatia. And Paul comes back to this area, preaches the gospel. And so the audience of the Galatians can be well expanded from just those cities in central Galatia, Pisidian Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, to this area where I live now. And so we're just beginning to see maps reflecting this new geographical reality that Luke understood when he's writing Acts in the middle of the or a little bit in the second half of the first century. And the remarkable thing is that after AD 70, all of this changes. And so Luke is reflecting the provincial realities before AD 70. So that tells us something extremely important.
Wow, that's powerful. And so just to put it down in terms that I can understand and so that my audience can understand, to me, what I'm hearing you say here powerfully suggests an earlier date for the book of Acts. If he's describing geography that would have been prior to the fall of Jerusalem, because most scholars are going to date Acts, or maybe not most scholars, but many critical scholars are going to at least date the book of Acts after 70. This gives some evidence that this would be a pre-70 date for Acts, or am I inferring too much from what you said?
No, it does. Well, 8070 is very important when we look at Roman provincial administration. So one of the publications I did was of a road monument that was found north of Antalya here on the Via Sebaste. And it describes the provincial reorganization in AD 70, which is what it dates to, where Galatia is now grouped together with Cappadocia as a single province, okay? Which is different than the earlier miles inscriptions we have here in Pergae. And so this tells us again that we've got a date. 8070 is extremely important. And I would hold this, for example, for the First Peter as well, which is addressed to communities in Northern Asia Minor. And so the five provinces that he names at the beginning in First Peter 1:1 all antedate AD 70. So again, putting First Peter after AD 70, it doesn't make sense from the Roman provincial names that you find in First Peter 1:1.
Right. This is for my viewers who might not understand the full implications of this. This is a blow, in my mind, to some of the critical scholarship that has gone forth on, First Peter, Second Peter. I'm assuming, uh, Dr. Wilson, you would probably take the traditional authorship of Peter as being from the Apostle Peter, but there have been, well, of course, critical scholars question almost everything. And so many
Sure.
critical scholars would be resisting that idea. And so you wonder if the Apostle Peter died under Nero, as church tradition says, then a date prior to 70 makes perfect sense. In other words, to me, this would be a little bit of added confirmation that we have the very words of the Apostle Peter. Again, am I inferring too much from this, Dr. Wilson?
No, I mean, this is what the texts that we find here in the epigraphic record can help us in understanding this, and we understand how the various emperors then would reorganize and leave their imprint through monuments to talk about what they're doing here on the ground here in Asia Minor.
Yeah, that's interesting. Can I circle back to something that you said a little bit earlier, and it kind of slipped by me just a little bit? I wanted to pick this back up.
Sure.
When you were talking particularly about the cities in Galatia, so you think does this help clarify for us? Because there's an age-old debate about, is it North Galatia, South Galatia? I mean, there's a debate that goes on about the specific audience. Do you
Sure.
think
Yeah.
what some of the things you guys have been able to uncover there really illuminates this debate? Is that what you're saying there?
Yeah, we follow one of the great Roman scholars of our era, Stephen Mitchell, who have had the opportunity to travel with, research with, who unfortunately passed away prematurely in January. But he has written extensively on this topic, and basically he concludes in his seminal volume Anatolia, there's no evidence whatsoever that Paul travels in North Galatia, and he amasses that evidence and very convincingly. And we follow Stephen in his opinion, and so. Middle Galatia, and now that we know that Pergae and Pamphylia were part of Galatia, those are most certainly the churches that Paul was addressing.
So it sounds like to me that you guys are doing some really it sounds like to me that you guys are doing some really groundbreaking work there, and it's going to take a bit for some of the resources that we're using that are probably on my shelf back here are to catch up with the scholarship that's being done there. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think one of the things in our the training of New Testament scholars and even pastors is we tend to use volumes that have been written, decades before, and we're not really trained in how to use archaeology, epigraphy, history, ancient history in our studies. And so one of the things I find is people are are quoting people within the trade. They're quoting other New Testament scholars rather than looking out and finding someone who's writing about Roman history, Roman roads, and who are the experts there. And I understand that getting the information, the sources for this is challenging to do, but it really is important for us to get it right.
That's fascinating to me because I suddenly I felt what sometimes you must feel because I've been in churches sometimes and I read Greek and I have my Greek New Testament open and I'm following along with someone who's speaking and they say the Greek says, and I'm reading my Greek New Testament, and it's like, no, it really doesn't say that. That must be
Exactly.
what it's like for you reading some secondary sources sometimes, and they're saying, hey, this road went this way, or this particular thing would have happened like this, and you're sitting there in Turkey, and it's like, no, that's probably not what happened.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I come back every year to present papers at academic society meetings in the United States to, try and bring my colleagues up to date with our research that's going on over here, and to at least get them considering, these new perspectives that are coming out, and we hopefully through our writings with various publishers and through journal articles, other people are reading these, and we're starting to get the word out a little bit about how important these kind of studies are to interpreting the New Testament.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Very, very interesting. So, just kind of overview that. So, I think even in this discussion we've had, some things have come out which I would not have expected. I thought about you being over there and it being an interesting thing, but really the work that you're doing is really important because it's shining a light on various areas of the scriptures that have been a little bit difficult for us to see in high definition, if you will. So, can you just kind of speak into that just a little bit?
Sure. Let me just tell you another example of how archaeology can inform our interpretation. I've just published an article on this, and I've got another one in progress to carry it forward. But one of the most popular metaphors in the book of Revelation, of course, is found in the letter to the Laodiceans. And I'm sure it's preached tens of thousands of times, and that's the temperature metaphor, where the Laodiceans are being accused of being lukewarm, neither hot nor cold. And looking back in the history of interpretation of that, from Ramsey backward, nobody connected this metaphor to the water system. So we have two British pastors who come to Laodicea in the 1950s, and they make this connection. And suddenly this now becomes the prevailing interpretation that this metaphor is related to lukewarm water that the Laodiceans are drinking. And so there's various permutations of that because we have a hot thermal springs to the north at Hierapolis, Colossae, which is nearby, had cold water, and here's poor Laodicea in between that had this bad water, and it was undrinkable, and it was lukewarm, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in the early 2000s, suddenly we have archaeological excavations happening at Laodicea. And the local university there has been working steadily now. And one of the things that they've worked on is the water system to Laodicea. Well, we now know that Laodicea's water system is exactly the same as its neighbors at Hierapolis, at Colossae, Ephesus, Smyrna, and everywhere else. They didn't have inferior water. And so the temperature metaphor there really has nothing to do with the water system in Laodicea. And so this is the results of that, and just re-erected a new nymphaeum dating to the early 2nd century at Laodicea, and they're doing a really nice work. And it has a large inscription there dealing with the water supply coming into the city. And one of the themes it affirms is from the very foundation of the city in the Hellenistic period under the Seleucids in the 4th century BC, they guaranteed that they had an excellent water supply coming into the city. So that said, suddenly now we've got to look to somewhere else to interpret what this metaphor is all about.
That's great. That's fascinating because I have used that metaphor before behind the pulpit, and now I have learned. I've been corrected on this, and what I think people who teach behind the pulpit, just because it preaches well, doesn't mean you ought to keep using it. So, I I've seen preachers who even after they find out that their little nugget of historical nugget is false, they continue to preach it. But
Yeah.
so that's illuminating.
Well, I have to admit too, I'm constantly having to update in my own opinions and things that I've written previously. I've got to go in and say, no, I don't hold that anymore. I've got new information, and you got to be willing to change when the evidence presents itself like that.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I actually, as you started out talking about that, I anticipated you telling me what I already knew about the water source there, and then you overturned that. And that's I think that really highlights the importance of the research that you're doing there. Yeah, it's great. Well, I tell you what, this has been fascinating. Dr. Wilson, as we wrap up this interview, can you point us to some of your writings, some resources that you would recommend for people?
I make all of my articles available online on academia.edu, so they're free to go there and download any of these. Constantly publishing books. I've got a book in progress on the ports of St. Paul that will be coming out in a year or two with my colleague Glenn. Thompson. We've just published a book with Lexham on Paul's arrival in Rome, and so we take a very detailed look at Paul's journey upon arriving in Puteoli in Italy and making his way up to Rome, something that's never been done before. So, but I keep coming back to Acts and Revelation, so I'm working on a companion volume to my Biblical Turkey here, which has been very successful. It's a guide to the Jewish and Christian sites here in Turkey, and wanting to do one just on the seven churches. So it's in progress, and hopefully will be out early next year.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I have the Zondervan Bible Backgrounds Commentary. You did the section on the Book of Revelation, which is appropriate because your specialty really is on the seven churches. And I've found this to be enormously helpful to me in my studies. And so I'd recommend for my viewers, go check out Dr. Wilson's material. It's very helpful, very edifying. And so, Dr. Wilson, I can't thank you again for having you on. Can't
Can I
thank you
mention
enough.
one
Yeah, please do.
one more resource? I was asked to contribute to the ESV Archaeology Bible a few years ago. And I wrote the Acts section, and then they came back and said, can you do the Revelation section too? And so there's some excellent information in those especially for lay people in churches in the ESV Archaeology Bible and those two particular books.
Yeah, that's great. I'll leave a link in the description for that, and I hope people will check that out. Thank you again, Dr. Wilson, for being on
Sure.
with us.
My pleasure.